The history of Europe since 1990 has been fraught with challenges, many unanticipated. The economic strength of the EU is undeniable, and yet some member nations struggle with inflation and high unemployment. The Schengen Agreement was a boon for business, for travel and tourism, and yet it contributed to the migrant crisis still facing Europe today. And always, always, there's the shadow of authoritarianism, of xenophobia, of genocide. Of course, the ethnic tensions which showed themselves throughout the 20th century and indeed throughout European history did not just disappear because new systems were in place. Case in point, the former Yugoslavia. In 1980, Croat-Slovenian Josip Broz Tito, the World War II hero and strong-willed leader of Yugoslavia, died. With his death, the unity of the Yugoslav state was threatened, as the traditional ethnic and religious animosities flared. For nearly a decade, the Yugoslav Communist Party struggled to find a leader strong enough to replace Tito. By the late 1980s, the job had fallen to a Serb communist, Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic, however, wasn't nearly as neutral as Tito had been, and he began to assert Serb authoritarianism, which other ethnicities, used to Tito's population-based centralization, resisted. In the spring of 1991, Slovenia and Croatia seceded from the Yugoslav Federation. Slovenia was ethnically homogeneous and largely Catholic. Milosevic wasn't terribly upset by its secession. Croatia, however, while largely Catholic, had a sizable Serbian and thus Orthodox population, which made up about 12% of the total population. When the new Croatian leadership instituted legislation which Milosevic perceived as anti-Serbian, he fought back, and the Croats quickly lost almost a quarter of their territory to the Serb-dominated Yugoslav army. The Yugoslav invasion of Croatia led to the deaths of hundreds of Croatians, who the Yugoslav army buried in mass graves. By the end of 1991, not only had the international community recognized both Slovenia and Croatia as independent, but the United States sponsored a ceasefire between Serbs and Croats in Croatia, and the situation seemed to be moving towards resolution. In 1992, Serbia and Montenegro agreed to rename Yugoslavia the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, while each country would retain some authority. The FRY remained under Milosevic's leadership. Bosnia and Herzegovina, a small, mostly Muslim state in the west, chose to declare independence rather than remain in the FRY, and the new country was recognized by most of Europe and by the United States. Although mostly Muslim, Bosnia did have a large Serbian minority of about 32%. Accordingly, just as he'd done with Croatia, Milosevic chose to support this Serbian minority. His excuse was that the Bosnian government was made up of Islamic fundamentalists, and without intervention, Bosnia's Serbian population might face oppression. Civil war engulfed Bosnia, where the republic's Muslim majority was trying to create a multinational and multicultural state. Encouraged by Milosevic, Serbs in Bosnia formed a guerrilla army and, backed by the Serbian government, gained the upper hand in the civil war. The international community did little to help. Although the UN did announce an economic embargo on Serbia, intended to influence Milosevic to stay out of Bosnia. However, at the same time, a UN arms embargo prevented the Bosnian Muslims from equipping their forces adequately enough to resist. The UN did also send peacekeeping forces to the area. While these forces aided in getting food and medicine to the Bosnian Muslims, they were forbidden from engaging with the Serbian army. This proved to be a costly error. In 1993, Bosnian Serbs declared the creation of the Bosnian Serb Republic under Radovan Karadzic, an ally of Milosevic's. Claiming to be the legitimate Bosnian government, they began the systematic genocide of the Bosnian Muslims. In early 1994, after the Serbs attacked Sarajevo with mortar shells, the United States attempted an intervention, trying to create an alliance between Bosnian Muslims and Croats. While the alliance went through, it failed to scare off the Serbs. Later, in 1994, after the UN discovered that the Serbs had disregarded several UN-designated safe haven towns for Bosnian Muslims and had attacked UN peacekeepers, NATO forces began using limited air attacks against Serbian ground forces. These attacks did not stop Serbian troops. At Srebrenica, another UN safe haven, Serbian General Ratko Mladic oversaw the mass killing of about 8,000 Muslim men and boys. Finally, in August of 1995, NATO began an effective campaign against Serbian troops. The success of the NATO mission led Serbian leaders to agree to attend peace talks in the United States. The result of these talks, the Dayton Peace Accords, ended with the recognition of Bosnia by the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. While the larger Yugoslav army pulled out of Bosnia, ethnic religious tensions remain. Politically, the country is split between a Serbian republic and a Bosniak Croat federation. Late in the 1990s, the Serb forces started attacking people of Albanian ethnicity living in the Yugoslav province of Kosovo in response to the actions of the Kosovo Liberation Army, a group which sought independence from the FRY. This led to the Kosovo War. From 1997 to 1999, hundreds of thousands of Albanian Kosovars fled their homes as Serb militias and the Yugoslav army attacked the civilian population. NATO pilots bombed the region in an attempt to drive back the army and Serb militias. UN peacekeeping forces stepped in to enforce an inter-ethnic truce, but many throughout the world felt that the intervention had come too late, and that it reflected great power self-interest rather than a commitment to maintaining peace and protecting human rights. In 2000, Milosevic lost control of the FRY under allegations that he had fixed the national elections. He was forced to admit defeat in September after repeated demonstrations, and was then arrested to stand trial for election fraud. However, with scarce evidence of the election fraud, the new president of the country, Milan Milutinovic, decided to send Milosevic to the International Criminal Tribunal at The Hague instead, so Milosevic could be tried for crimes against humanity. Why did Milutinovic do so? The FRY remained isolated by the international community, and this was probably a gesture of goodwill. In 2002, the governments of Serbia and Montenegro agreed to end the name Yugoslavia, given its negative connotations, and announced the foundation of the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro. However, in 2006, Montenegro held a referendum and decided to secede from the State Union, which led Serbia to declare itself an independent republic. The work of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is ongoing. Milosevic died in 2006 in prison. Karadzic is currently guilty of coordinating the attack at Srebrenica and was sentenced to 40 years in prison beginning in 2016. Mladic, who was a fugitive until 2011, remains on trial. The focus on ethnic groups in the Balkans leads to a larger conversation about Europe's population, and maybe to some deeper understanding about why such pointed ethnic tensions persist across the region. By 1995, native Europe was experiencing negative growth, more deaths than births, while less industrially developed countries, and remember, most of those had been European colonies, accounted for 98% of the global population growth. Since 1950, the annual growth rate of the birth population in Europe had been about 2%. By 1999, that rate was estimated at 1.5%. Fertility rates had also been declining in the West for decades, and that decline was beginning to spread throughout the world. By 1995, an estimated 58% of couples globally used birth control. At the same time, global migration exploded in the 1970s as millions of people flocked to the West. Some of this migration was due to post-colonial turmoil, other migration was due to the EEC and the numbers of European foreigners employed by oil-producing companies. In general, these foreign workers amounted to about 30% of the European workforce. These economic migrants, many of whom tried to become permanent immigrants to Europe, became handy scapegoats in countries where, beginning in the late 1970s, unemployment was hard to control. Across Europe, but especially in countries which had once been touched by Nazi influence, this often led to the creation of anti-immigrant, anti-tolerant political parties which fought to control the numbers of African and Arab immigrants. In Austria, for example, such a party, the Freedom Party of Austria, became dominant again after the 1999 elections. This party, like the others, called for the creation of racially and ethnically pure nations. Germany has seen the rise of Alternative for Germany, the AfD, while Hungary has Jobbik, the Movement for a Better Hungary, Poland, the Law and Justice Party, the PIS, And France has the National Front. In fact, even Britain has a National Front party. In fact, Europe-wide, these nationalist parties often belong to ACER, the Alliance of Conservative and Reformist Parties in Europe. In addition to sometimes virulent nationalism and anti-immigrant platforms, these parties tend to be Eurosceptic, meaning they challenge the benefits of the European Union. In the late 20-teens, these parties have been ascendant in European politics. This emergent nationalism is one of the reasons migrants so desperately want to become citizens of the country to which they came to work. But, unlike in the Western Hemisphere, where most countries have citizenship by birth laws, attaining citizenship in a European country is often quite difficult. In Switzerland and Germany, the criterion of common ancestry is used to determine citizenship and who has political and civil rights. In Switzerland, for example, a person is automatically granted citizenship if they are born to married Swiss parents or an unmarried Swiss mother. This is referred to as jus sanguinis, citizenship by blood. Someone who's lived in Switzerland continuously for 10 years is eligible to apply either for permanent residency or naturalization. Permanent residents get to live and work in Switzerland, including the right to establish their own business. They pay taxes and thus are eligible for welfare benefits. They cannot, however, vote or run for public office. Those who apply for naturalization must demonstrate the ability to speak one of the languages common to Switzerland, German, French, Italian, or Romansh, and must also demonstrate acculturation. Finally, a person can earn naturalization through marriage if they've resided in Switzerland for at least 5 years and their marriage to a Swiss citizen is at least 3 years old. In Germany, similar laws are in place. German permanent residence is available after 5 continuous years living in Germany if you can also demonstrate a livelihood with health benefits, command of the German language, a home, and have no criminal record. Thanks to the Schengen Agreement, having German permanent residency allows you to live elsewhere in the EU under the same conditions. Once you've lived in Germany for 8 continuous years, you can apply for naturalization. All the conditions required of permanent residency status stand. Additionally, you take an hour-long test in German about Germany, usually about culture and politics, and you renounce your former citizenship, unless you're from an EU country, you're the child of an American citizen, you're from a former Soviet state, or you're from a country that does not recognize the renunciation of citizenship like Iran, Morocco, or Syria. As with Switzerland, in Germany naturalization is possible through marriage. In order to claim citizenship this way, a person must be able to prove German residency for at least 3 years, and their marriage to a German citizen must be at least 2 years old. At the beginning of the 21st century, Europe began to experience a migrant crisis for which it was completely unprepared. Caused initially by political instability in various African countries, again, countries which had once been European colonies, these migrants hope to reach a European country where they can apply for asylum and, once granted, can be considered refugees who can then plan on naturalization. As you can see on the graph, the sheer numbers of people attempting travel to Europe essentially doubled year over year. The EU tried to establish protocols for the processing of these people who did manage to set foot within the EU, but those countries that tended to be the first to see migrants, basically Mediterranean countries, were quickly overwhelmed by the numbers, and so migrants were simply put on trains heading north. Some countries, like Germany, took in as many as 1 million refugees in a single year, while other countries ultimately responded to the crisis by trying to close down their borders, thus coming perilously close to violating the Schengen Agreement.
Some migrants told us, once you pay, you cannot go back.
They slap you. Even you want to go to urine, sometimes they refuse.
They only put you in the boat and leave you there. It's now left to you. I passed through the same road with them, but it's really, it's a risk. It's very risky. It's very risky.
Some of those fleeing precarious political situations are seeking respite from religious fundamentalism. Perhaps inevitably, globalization has led to tensions between competing cultural values. Most notably, this religious fundamentalism, lately in the form of the Islamism, the Islamic militancy or fundamentalism, of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, has influenced multiple attacks across Europe and the world. While the vast majority of Islamist attacks target Muslims who don't adhere to Islamism's platform, those attacks which have targeted Europeans have increased ethnic tensions within Europe. The graph on screen shows a timeline of these attacks between 2001 and March 2017. Each square represents a person killed in the attack, and the colors represent motivation behind the attack. Red signifies jihadist or Islamist attacks, while green or gray denote attacks with other motivations. Islamist attacks in Europe have occurred across the continent and the UK, although France has definitely been the hardest hit, experiencing 3 attacks in 2015 alone. The images on screen represent only some of these attacks. While some, such as the Copenhagen attack on a synagogue, have explicitly attacked people of Jewish ethnicity, more often these attacks seem to hit at the Western values of Europe's democracies, whose values are diametrically opposed to the values of Islamism. Of course, Islamists don't have a monopoly on fundamentalism, and in the wake of both the migrant crisis and Islamist attacks in Europe, some individuals influenced by ultra-nationalist sentiment have in turn attacked those vulnerable migrants and refugees who fled their homes in search of a better opportunity in Europe. And sometimes they just attack their own countrymen. Perhaps the most famous, certainly the most deadly, of these right-wing attacks was that in Norway in 2011, when Anders Breivik used bombs and guns to kill 77 people, most of them teenagers attending a summer camp. Breivik, a self-professed fascist, claimed to be protecting ethno-nationalists who he felt were oppressed by the Norwegian government. More recently, members affiliated with some of Europe's right-wing parties have attacked buses of migrants and even the hotels where migrants are living, as these migrants wait to hear whether they've been granted asylum. In Germany in 2015, there were reports of people clapping and cheering, proclaiming, "We are the folk," as one such hotel burned. In response, there were counter-demonstrations, where those claiming to represent most of Germany welcomed migrants as refugees. And of course, it continues. And so European history ends. Except, of course, that it doesn't. There's so much more to learn, to know, to question. My hope for you, as you continue to learn about and explore the world around you, is that you continue asking questions, seeking those connections, pursuing those leads, until you come to an informed understanding of Europe certainly, and then the world more broadly. Good luck with that lifelong learning.